my topic. That it's a probably perhaps the most complex talk I will give of the year. And so for those of you who think I'm unnecessarily complex anyway, this is going to be how much the more so. And because as you see in my Shabbat thought, on our way to the high holidays, I want us to start with the deepest experience of what we're going to call the self, as Socrates would call it, self-knowledge. You remember he says the unexamined life is not worth living. He says this in the Apology, which is Socrates' license for trying to bring people in Athens to self-knowledge. Of course, that does not end well for him, because people avoid self-knowledge. They don't want to know themselves. They don't want anybody walking around trying to make them get to know themselves. It was a dangerous thing that he did. So in the dialogue called the Phaedo, which is where people are at his deathbed, he says, "I can do no other." And then he gives an interesting reason, both in the Apology and in the Phaedo, where he says he has a daimon, D-A-I-M-O-N. He has an inner guiding spirit that governs his life. And the inner guiding spirit is not reason. So one thing we say philosophically is you can have all the emotions that you want, but you don't know if acting on the emotion is the right thing until you reason yourself through it. So I'm not against emotions. Emotions are our bridge to the world. They're just not good guides. So in general, a person who learns how to reason, how to be rational, you'll be able to deal with your emotions and decide important things. What to do in a difficult relationship. Should I stay with a job or not stay with a job? What political views should I take? Now, so we have to, for a moment, put our passions aside and think rationally. Of course, when we don't need to think rationally, then spontaneity, emotions, and feelings are the way to go until something goes wrong. And then, of course, our feelings and our emotions can take us to terrible places. However, as we go to this deeper level, reason is not the central governing feature of our inner lives. I want to go with Socrates here and say there's some kind of spiritual center that we must encourage to speak. Now, we do see this in the Bible. So, for example, and I'll bring more verses from the Bible as we go along, but not today. When you look at the Psalms, mostly Psalms, but a few Proverbs, the author of some Psalms has gone into the depth of the self and is writing from the depths of the self. Now, they're not giving mitzvahs, they're not getting Torah, they're not giving mishpatim and chukim. They've tapped into something, sometimes in great joy, sometimes in great pain. But you can tell they've gone into the maze of the inner life, and they have found some authentic voice for that moment, and through great poetic gifts have expressed it. So the question is, what do you find there? So I'll call that for now, just for this moment, the origin of poetry. The origin of poetry. Again, whether you're a good poet or not a good poet, I'm a terrible poet, but I know you'll never have the evidence for why I'm a terrible poet. I guarantee you that right now. But when you go into that place, you can see where poetry comes from, because the soul is trying on language that is not, we call it ratiocinative language. You're not trying to figure out the word through reasoning. You're having a raw experience of yourself, of your life purpose, of tragedy, of joy. It doesn't come out as an Aristotelian disquisition, that's for sure. This is why I prefer Plato to Aristotle. I mean, when you read Socrates, you're going into the mysterious maze of the inner life. So when you go and you discover what Socrates called the daimon, I'll talk about that more in a moment, but for now we're going to call it the origin of poetry, and you can't get any deeper than that. That's one thing I want to share with this. And therefore, the inner path that I'm talking about is not meditation. Oftentimes, traditional Eastern meditation wants to go above consciousness, quiet down consciousness, and as it were, focus on a single note, a single color, as it were, distilling consciousness. So this is not, if I'm describing certain what we call alpha meditation correctly. This is not that. This is much more what we call the delta wave meditation. And the delta waves, when if you hooked up yourself to a brainwave machine, it's the or theta waves. I'm sorry, theta waves, where you're going into archetypal unconsciousness of images and myths and stories and poetry. The place where I think, for example, Rilke wrote from, and that we experience every Friday night through the great gifts of Shanti, who brings us these poems. Well, what part of consciousness? This is not meditation where you exited, but it's also not day-to-day consciousness where you're problem solving. It's not rational. You cannot subject a poem to rational scrutiny. It's something else. So when I study the nature of the brain, I understand to be theta waves, that when you go in there, and by the way, I got myself hooked up to a machine, and the person led me through different kinds of consciousness, and they said, okay, those are your alpha waves, and those are your beta, and that's your theta. So this really is science. Something happens to your brain when you go there. Now, so I want to say that when you go into this consciousness, you can exit it and go into alpha stilled consciousness. But from my perspective, that's not the deepest thing. It's very calming. It's very relaxing. But I'm against the idea that mind emptying meditation is the deepest thing. I don't even think it's the second or third deepest thing. I'm not saying it's not useful. It's not the deepest thing from my perspective. From my perspective, the deepest thing is going so deep into consciousness that you find, as it were, the origins of poetry and something like your deepest experience at that moment. So I want to share with you a foundational book that I read by Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who was a personal teacher of mine, not frequent, but every time he and I did meet, it was profound and transformative. But I read a book of his called The First Step, and I want to share with you a practice. In the first step, you still consciousness as much as you can. Yeah, but remember, you're not escaping, you're just stilling it. And when you're still, then you reach inside again to the essential self, authentic self, which is not an object. It's not something that's stable and fixed. It's a state of mind. And in the book, he says, say the most truthful thing that you can possibly say. And I remember when I first did this meditation about 1982, 83. I remember I said platitudes. And then I hit a core pain in my life, a core concern. And when I uttered it, I just broke into tears. I had said the truest thing into the heart of the universe. And I remember it so utterly distinctly, this idea of quieting, going in. I still engage in this meditation, but what's fascinating is it's there waiting for you. Which is one reason last night, by the way, when I was teaching a preface to this, we went into all the things going on in Israel, and they're really super important. But I ended the session by saying, it's so important that we solve this stuff and address this stuff and fight the good fight, but don't lose track of your soul. Don't lose track of the deep inner being that is calling you. And then 2-3 steps out, we've got to fight the fight to save Western civilization, to save the state of Israel and save America. All that's true. But there's another journey that we have to take, and not let our struggles out in the world and even our interpersonal struggles stop us from this deep experience of self-knowledge, discovering what Socrates called his daimon, what I'm going to call the authentic self, which, remember, is not a fixed place, but rather a state of consciousness where the truest thing that can be said can be said. You don't know what the truest thing is until you go there. And evidence that you've said the truest thing is that you break into tears because an utter life truth has come forward. Uh, so that's the second step, what I want to say this morning. The third step that I want to say this morning, here's I'm borrowing from Ernst Cassirer, Cassier. He has a book called An Essay on Man, 1944. It's still, of the 8 books I carried to Israel with me before our container arrived, this was one of them, which means for me to remember who I am, the 8 books I need to have physical, tactile with me. One of them is Essay on Man by Ernst Cassirer. I have the Plato book in the container. I'm reading it on Kindle. Cassir's book, I need to have it in my hand. So Cassirer was a great, what we're going to call a philosophic anthropologist. He's trying to come up with a theory of the human being, hence the title, An Essay on Man. He had written 15 or 20 years earlier a 3-volume work called Theory of Symbolic Forms. Just to triangulate him, he was in the same time as Martin Heidegger. He was, I think he was the teacher of Susanne K. Langer. So the whole idea of the symbolic nature of consciousness, Cassirer is one of those people. So they asked him, could you rewrite it for us? Could you? And he said, the book is done. He says, I agree with most of it, not all of it. And he writes in the preface to Essay on Man, he said, when I was younger, I wrote 3-volume books. Now that I'm older, I'm going to write a 1-volume book. I'm going to distill it down. He said, I'm not writing for academics. I don't need to prove how smart I am. I want to write this for intelligent people who want to understand the nature of consciousness, the symbolic nature of consciousness. So the next thing I want to say is when you go into that experience of the authentic self, experience your own daimon, your own inner guide, that which says to you, time to be rational, time to be joyous, time to let your guard down. Whatever that regulatory guide is that tells you that guides you to be authentic and true to the moment. Cassirer says that's where you find religion. Now, Cassirer was not a religious, he was Jewish, but not a religious Jew, but he studied religion. And he said the great problem of religion, as I've shared with you, especially since medieval religion, because it was, again, trying to square Aristotle with revelation. And I agree with them deeply. I'm a profound admirer of Maimonides, for example, but as I said, as I taught at the end of last summer, for all of the wisdom and brilliance of Maimonides, he's not a path to the soul, nor is Aristotle. Now, there's brilliance in both, but they're not path to the soul. If I want to choose one between Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, I'll go with Socrates and Plato. If I want to go to the greatest path to the soul, it's literature and poetry, which takes me back to the archetypal myths in the Hebrew Bible and the profundity of the prophets and Psalms, etc. So what happens is when let's say you go into that world and you say that the deepest truth that can be said, now try to write a poem. Try to write a poem. And now you're in language. And see what metaphors your soul comes up with. See what your pain is. See what your hopes are, your dreams, your tragedy. And you will find as you try to write, again, it doesn't have to be good poetry, you don't have to share it with anybody. But as you try to write that poetry, you're going to end up with not prose, but with metaphors and breaking the molds of prosaic language because your soul is trying to talk. He says, when you go into that mode, you're not relying on rationality to lead you to the truth. You're going into a maze. When I was rereading Cassirer this week, preparing for this morning, Los Angeles time, I thought about a person looking for what they believe in and going to a great park with great monuments of different religions and different ideas, and he asked the guide, well, which one is true? He says, oh, God's not in the park of monuments. See that forest over there? You got to go there. It's in the deep, dark, enchanted forest where you will feel terror and you will feel alone and you will feel in a maze and you won't know how to get out. this is the image that came up to me as I was reading Kassir. He says, ideally, religion does not try to clarify, which was the great mistake of medieval theology. Religion is not there to clarify. Religion is to take you into the mystery in many different ways. In our tradition, of course, it's the biblical text, certain rabbinic texts, our mystical text, and for me, primarily the Siddur, which I want to get back into this coming year. But for me, when people say, "Oh, I don't believe in," they say to me, I can't pray from the Siddur because I don't believe in it. I thought to myself, that's tragic. That you read a poem and say, well, do I believe it or not? Who reads a poem and says, do I believe it or not? When you read a poem, you allow the poem to grab your inner life by the lapels and look at you and say, as Rilke said, you have to change your life. So the job of in my mind, of the Siddur is to take you into the soul, is to take you into the forest, not as some kind of declaration of faith. So Kassir says, there's no other word for some part of human culture that a community of people can use to help them confront the maze of human depth with no answer, but rather access. And so he's asking himself, and he's writing this in the 1940s, of course, very much influenced by Jung and others, that what he sees is a painfully destructive superficiality of human beings. In the German after the war, the German Frankfurt School, which was kind of came out of the postmodernism and neo-Marxian a theory, critical theory. The good side of critical theory was trying to communicate that the productive society, the free market society of consumer goods and creating wealth, there's nothing. I mean, they said there's nothing wrong with it. I actually don't think that. But you're led to the mistake that is your essence. The essence is to work, consume, produce. And there's nothing in our culture that encourages us. Now, I'm certainly not in the critical theory, the neo-Marxian idea, there's some kind of ruling class plan to oppress. I think when one engages too much in the production world, meaning producing, consuming, enjoying, which are all fantastic things, for a person to etch out in their moment, outside all the distractions and the wonderful television and all the great things there are to do out there and the endless blogs that I read and newsletters that I get, my depth can be robbed of me. And so one has to cultivate and develop one's own theory of symbolic forms. What's the symbol system that you live in? Now, I think that's why we need to have a religion. Now, the problem with religion, of course, is religion has, in the modern mind, has produced from skepticism all the way to hatred. When I look at some of my publications that I read, there's a clear anti-religious bias. Houston Smith wrote about this, that there's a sense that religion is oppressive, religion takes away our humanity, but they don't offer anything else. Meaning, from my perspective, religion properly practiced takes us into the mystery. We have to let go of dogma. We have to let go of belief systems and use the images and metaphors and symbols of religion to cultivate our own inner lives. So when you go back into your inner life and you find stillness and you say the deepest truth at that moment, and then you try to write a poem about it and it's filled with metaphors, now you're into the mystery. Now the question is, how do you stay there? What kind of a world is in there? Well, in the theory of symbolic forms, ideally we find a shared world. Now, if you go into the study of literature and poetry, which I strongly recommend, because I have my few favorites, the problem is, if alternative reality, let's say we came on Shabbos mornings to study Socrates and Rilke, there would only be a few of us here. We're propelled by the inertia of religion, meaning either you're Jewish, attracted to Judaism, becoming Jewish, know that there's something really cool and happening with the archetypal study, but we have a ready-made communal literature. So on our way to the Yamim Noraim, then you start to ask, not only what symbol systems am I producing, but then you defer to the symbol systems of the religion, meaning we've had many generations have gone before us. This is the conservative in me speaking, that we don't have to reinvent reality every generation. In fact, there is a profound weight of tradition conserved by generation after generation. And either it can come down to us, we can dismiss it and say, I'll think this all out myself, which in many ways is the modern attitude toward religion. The conservative in me says we need to conserve that tradition. And before I think of something else, which I'm sure I will, let me at first face the weight, depth, and brilliance of this tradition. And at least at the first to the 20th pass, understand what it's saying to me as my soul engages in the tradition. So, of course, there are things I reject. I mean, there are all kinds of teachings in the Bible that I say it's not the will of God, and I reject it. So many issues, but they're peripheral for me. For example, reading these great archetypal narratives and reading Psalms and all the other parts of our tradition. So the next step out from, let's say, the discovery of the daimon, the discovery of the authentic self moment, and saying your truth. In one moment, it's joy and gratitude. Another moment is pain and tragedy. When you go in there, you're going to find different things at different days and different times of the day. But Reb Zalman would say, and by the way, he's following Rabbi Nachman here. This is a Rabbi Nachman tradition. Find your core center, speak the truth contained there, meditate on it, work it out, and then do it again tomorrow. So then we end up, as I've done this past week, then I say to myself, what's next? What do I do next now that I've been there? Well, I say, what does my tradition teach me? And as I look toward this incredible, how shall I say it, complex of edifices called the High Holidays over the horizon, and I know I have to go there, I as it were, want to extract from the High Holidays and say, what do I need to know and do now to pave the path there? So notice I'm deferring to the tradition. I don't have to invent the Yamim Noraim, the days of awe. They're there waiting for me. Now, again, I'm not obeying them. I'm entering them. I want to have discourse with the tradition. And again, this is one thing that Kassir, just says in the religious tradition, it's not about dogmatics. It's about encountering mystery. And so as I look over the horizon into this incredible maze of teachings waiting for me, I call out and say, what do I need to do now to pave the way there? I don't know what's going to say it because only my soul knows. But because I know the High Holidays so well, one word that comes up is the word regret. If part of what the High Holidays are on Rosh Hashanah, where you announce the sovereignty of a world of value, the sovereignty of the world of the soul, the sovereignty of moral realism, if that's the step of Rosh Hashanah, then you have to ask yourself, when and in what ways have I not been living faithful to that call that I'm going to call the sovereignty of the world of value? And what this allows me to do is to go from this daimon, as it were, and look at the parts of myself that are recalcitrant, that don't want to live a life of truth, that wants to live some other kind of life. Now, what propels me to the work of the shadow? What propels me to look for the recalcitrant, wayward sides of the self? It's the High Holidays. The High Holidays say, as you make your way, now I'm personifying them, as you make your way toward us, you need to be a person of truth. And if you want to arrive at the gates of the High Holidays as a person of truth, you have to be accountable for the parts of you that are not true. It's as if high holders are saying to me, bring all that in, bring it into the city of God, and we'll work all that out. But you got to bring it and not ignore it. You can't, you ought not repress it. It has to be present to you. So another part of what happens for me during this day, going from the experience of pure being, the experience of the daimon, of the deepest thing in my heart, of my own activating the truth of metaphoric language, my accepting my encounter with the wisdom tradition, is then just take a moment and say, how is my wisdom tradition calling me? What does it call out of me? Again, on different days, different things will be called out of me. And I want to go into it because I think every one of you needs to do this. All right, so to sum up for today, in this first Sabbath, on the way to the Yamim Noraim, I want us to use this Socratic idea of having a daimon, an inner spiritual governing force that is calling us to be people of truth, to live lives of truth, even though there might be a price to pay. Sometimes being a person of truth, living a life of truth, there might be a price to pay. And in the Socratic dialogue where Socrates is facing his death and his friends say, hey, escape the city, they sentence you to die, run with us. He said, if I run from the city and I go to another city to live, I'm going to be the guy who ran. I'm the guy who couldn't stand the consequences of telling the truth. He says, they're going to ridicule me. They're going to make fun of me. That at the moment of truth, I wouldn't be a person of truth. He says, so I have to die. I have to die in the city that condemned me to death for living a life of truth. I mean, when you read this, I was brought to tears when I read this. And I thought to myself, like, am I a person of truth or not? This is what Socrates was saying to his friends who wanted to help him escape the city. He says, what are you guys talking about? You want me to betray myself, go somewhere else and see the vagabond who couldn't live the life of truth? That's what you want me to be? So we'll be setting these on Thursday nights if we if I have enough people. So I want you to find that. I want you to find what is my truth. Now, again, not a final truth, not as if it's a fixed thing, but a moment of truth at that moment, that as it were is calling out and calling you forward. Again, it's a complex idea I'm trying to teach. I don't have the exact language for it. It's poetic, it's metaphoric. It deals with consciousness and the unconscious, theories of symbolic forms. But I hope you'll be inspired through these ideas to take this first step. And I continue to go through this first step. My goal is to get to the second week, and I don't know yet what the second week's going to be because I haven't fully gone through the first step of this week. So more or less today is a call to depth, a call to truth, a call to authenticity, a call to the examined life, a call to self-knowledge in a courageous and resolute way. Put ourselves deeply there, let that voice speak, and let it guide us to the next step on this journey.